Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Migration Studies webinar, the FEER Survey on the Effects of U.S. Immigration and Refugee Policies on Faith-Based Organizations. My name is Guadalupe Chavez, Outreach and Events Assistant at the Center for Migration Studies. In this webinar, we will discuss the report, The Effects of Immigration Enforcement on Faith-Based Organizations, and analysis of the FEER Survey. The report analyzes the Federal Enforcement Effect Research Survey, which describes the impact of U.S. policies on faith-based organizations that serve and advocate with immigrant and refugee populations. The agenda for this webinar is as follows. Mike Nicholson, CMS's researcher, will discuss the survey's methodology, and our Executive Director, Donald Kerwin, will present top-line findings and places these findings in context. Next, our panelist, Estela Villagrán Manancero from the National Catholic Association of Diocesan Directors for Hispanic Ministry and Director of Latino Ministry at the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, Bill Canny from Migration and Refugee Services at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and Brian Corbin from Catholic Charities USA will discuss how U.S. immigration and refugee policies have affected their network's ability to serve immigrants and refugees, and conversely, how they have affected the ability of immigrants and refugees to access their services. Before we begin this webinar, some things to keep in mind. Feel free to type your questions in the chat or question box located in your control panel, or send your questions by email to gchavez@cmsny.org throughout the webinar, and I will raise them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This webinar cannot be recorded without permission. The recording and slides will be available on CMS's website. To keep background noise at minimum, I have muted all participants except the panelists. And now we'll begin the webinar with our first panelist, Mike Nicholson.
Hi. So my name is Mike Nicholson. I'm the researcher at the Center for Migration Studies of New York. So I'll be talking a little bit about the methodology of the FEER survey. So the key research question that we asked in this survey is, how have the Trump administration's policies affected Catholic organizations' work with immigrants? And this is an important question because faith-based organizations provide vital services to immigrants and often serve as intermediaries between immigrant communities and American society more broadly. But to date, efforts or studies of the effects of enforcement have focused mostly on their effects on migrants and haven't looked at organizations providing service to these migrants. So our survey, we had 170 organizations respond to the survey, and these responses were recorded between January 7th and February 22nd, 2019. The survey was administered on Qualtrics, and the respondents were recruited via CMS's listserv and through our contacts. So on this slide, you can see a breakdown of the organizations that responded to the survey. 34% were social services, namely different branches of Catholic Charities. The second largest group to respond it consisted of parishes, which constituted 21% of the respondents. But we had a large array of respondents from different types of organizations. And these respondents were in 38 states in the District of Columbia. By far, the largest number of respondents were in California, but we also had many respondents in Texas, New York, Ohio, Florida, and many other states. The top countries of origin of immigrants that these organizations served were Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, which in each of those cases, either almost 100 or more than 100 organizations responded that they serve immigrants from these countries. But there were many different other countries also that these organizations serve. And these organizations provide many services to immigrants, including Know Your Rights presentation. We had 86 organizations report that they provide the service to immigrants, legal services, food pantries, and many other services that you can see in this chart. We also found that there are relatively few immigrants in leadership positions in the organizations that responded to the survey. 58% of the organizations reported that immigrants constitute less than 25% of their agency's leadership, but 49.6% reported that immigrants represent 75% or more of the people using their services. So now I'm going to pass the phone to Don Kerwin, our executive director, to discuss briefly some of the top line findings of the survey.
Thank you, Mike. Well, we originally undertook this survey in preparation for an annual gathering that we organized with colleague agencies regarding the work of Catholic institutions on immigrant integration. We didn't at the time have great plans for the survey, nor did we call it the FEER Survey until we started to actually look at the findings of the survey. We had kind of a more generic name for it at the outset. By way of background and what led to this survey, in 2016, CMS, Clinic, Catholic Charities USA, and the U.S. Bishop's Secretariat for Cultural Diversity in the Church partnered on 2 surveys of Catholic institutions and on their work with immigrants. In these surveys, respondents identified more traditional obstacles to their work with immigrants than were identified in the FEER survey. In other words, they talked about transportation problems and language barriers and low income being a barrier and lack of status and funding limitations. In fact, in these 2 surveys, only 12% of respondents identified anti-immigrant policies as one of their biggest obstacles to serving immigrants. Subsequently, in 2018, we conducted a study with the Kino Border Institute and the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States on the impact of deportation on deportees, on families, and on faith communities. Kino Border interviewed deportees in Nogales, Sonora, and CMS and the Jesuit Conference interviewed the family members of deportees and pastoral workers in U.S. parishes that had experienced deportation in their parish community. Interestingly to us, the parishes viewed deportation as both a social problem and as a barrier to their pastoral work with immigrants. I mean, this is very intuitive if you think about it. Deportation separates families, it interferes with the timing of sacraments, it depopulates parishes, it reduces attendance at parish ministries and programs. So this is kind of the background to the FEER survey, which more explicitly examined the impact of immigration enforcement and other factors on the work of Catholic institutions with immigrants. And I've finally gotten to the slide that we're on now, which is kind of top-line findings for this survey. So nearly 3/4 of the respondents reported an increase in enforcement in their communities since January 2017, which was the first month of the Trump administration. Overall, they also reported increased demand for their services from immigrants during this period. And I should say, by the way, as Mike pointed out in his presentation, the work of these respondents is very extensive and diverse, particularly the work of Catholic charities and parishes. The kinds of services, the diversity of services that they provide is really remarkable. The respondents in the FEER survey also reported struggling to meet the increased demand for services, though most had in fact expanded their work with immigrants and had been trying to rise to the occasion. 59% of them listed as one of their greatest obstacles in serving immigrants and their families that increased demand actually outpaced their resources. This was the second highest response to this question behind funding limitations as an obstacle. Another 59%, and this was the highest response to this particular question, reported that fear of apprehension and deportation had negatively impacted immigrants' access to their services. And 57% said that federal enforcement had very negatively affected immigrants' participation in their programs and ministries. So here are some, kind of some random quotes from respondents. And generally what they go to, and what other quotes and other responses that we got go to, is that immigrants fear seeking services or benefits that will lead to their deportation, or that they think will backfire in some way in their lives or in terms of their particular cases in ways that they can't predict. From my perspective, I found it particularly troubling to hear that immigrants fear attending Know Your Rights or legal screening or naturalization workshops, which we did here, because these would allow them to gain permanent status or citizenship, and you would hope that that goal would be broadly supported and not undermined by U.S. policies, but in fact, just the opposite is happening. There's also been recent press reports of immigrant women who are fearful to come forward because for domestic violence problems that they're having, which is also extraordinarily troubling, of course. So in terms of the context of these findings, we know that the federal government and the local communities depend heavily on faith-based organizations. You can read about the work of faith-based organizations all across the country, but most recently, particularly around the U.S.-Mexico border, and they're really playing the kind of role that government could be playing and should be playing. They also, the government also regularly courts faith-based organizations and often meaningfully partner with them, including what's happening now to a certain extent on the U.S.-Mexico border. Although sometimes the courting is more for PR purposes too. And the federal government and politicians often use the language of religious liberty in various contexts, but not in the immigration context. For us, the FEER survey finds that it's not only immigrants and refugees that are hurt by U.S. policies and by the failure of Congress and the administration to reform our antiquated and inadequate immigration laws. It's also faith-based institutions and those who seek to practice their faith through these institutions that are hurt. Those who day in and out welcome the stranger, serve the poor, and try to promote the common good. And what this survey, I think, lifts up is that this is a major problem as well. So let me turn to our experts, our close colleagues now. Estela is on, and next Bill Canny, and then Brian Corbin, who can speak on this challenge from the perspectives of their own diverse institutions and networks. And those networks are pastoral networks, they're Catholic charities, they're refugee resettlement networks, and they're other networks as well. So we're going to ask them to speak about the survey and speak about what they're seeing within their own networks. And after they do that, then we will go to some questions and answers.
Okay. Thank you, Don, and thank you for inviting me to participate, and certainly for the good work of the Center for Migration Studies. It's greatly appreciated here at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Migration Refugee Services at the conference is a unique, rather operational office in that it takes federal grants and works with partners across the country, particularly Catholic charities, to provide services to refugees and immigrants and unaccompanied children and children in need of foster care, etc. So it's unique, and we have certainly witnessed a change in both our own department, but also across the country in the work of the Catholic Church at large in, if you will, welcoming the stranger. The first major change was related to the relatively drastic reduction in refugees that our country takes. We are currently down to taking about 25,000 refugees in fiscal year 2019. the average since 1980 has been approximately 95,000 refugees. So that's a rather drastic change. And that program, largely federally funded, but in fact a private-public partnership between not only the Catholic Church, but other faiths and organizations across the country, 9 in total, 9 networks, including our own, participate in this particular program. After the last presidential election, we began to see, and with the new administration, cuts, reductions in the number of refugees that were allowed to come into the country. This had a relatively dramatic effect on the infrastructure that had been developed over about the last 30 years, an infrastructure that would, virtually receive an airport a refugee at an airport, and for a period of 3 months to 5 years, help them and that family integrate into the country. There were some 320 affiliates across the United States in all states who were receiving refugees, and the Catholic Church, primarily, again, Catholic charities organizations, represented about 90 of those. With the reductions from around 85,000, 90,000 to now 25,000, that network has been cut virtually down to about 40% of what it was. For our purposes, Catholic charities, some 90 were participating 3 years ago, 90 Catholic charities, and now we have 45. So a dramatic cut in the infrastructure, and therefore in those staff who are engaged in receiving and assisting refugees in our country, including the number of parishes involved. So less participation. At the same time, as we know, the number of asylum seekers has increased dramatically, particularly at our southern border. And I know Brian Corbin will talk about more specifically some of the activities along the border. But what I can say is those 9 resettlement agencies, including our own, interestingly began to turn their attention and their resources towards those asylum seekers. You began to see more funds being raised for asylum seekers, more staff dedicated to assisting asylum seekers. So you had a bit of an awakening. And what's interesting is that, I can say that there was a bit of a comfort zone in refugee resettlement that perhaps prevented we as agencies of concern focusing more on the asylum seeker. So I think there has been a indirect side effect of the lower number of refugees, in that it has turned organizational interest towards the needs of asylum seekers. Now, I'll just provide one example that will, I think, buttress the results of the survey. We participated in the reunification of families. If you remember, almost a year ago now, the Trump administration split families up. There was a tremendous outcry, and they were forced to reunite families. At that time, they called on or asked 2 organizations to assist them. One was ourselves at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, in collaboration with Catholic charities across the country, and then the second was Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services. We intended to serve, or we were, if you will, given access to, at the border, initially assisted 881 families. Of these, after a period of 9 months, 359 families were successfully provided with some level of case management support, some level of social services. And for most of those, it was a full 3 months of services, whether it was legal assistance of some sort, know your rights, or medical, educational, helping children get to school, access to benefits such as food stamps, etc. Some of the work was to try and hook, if you will, families up with legal assistance. But what I can say is that a good proportion of families declined services. They were hesitant. They reported fear of engaging in services due partially, certainly, to the traumatic experience they had had, which caused distrust of authority figures. But certainly also it was reported in many cases that they were afraid of engaging the system for fear of being identified and deported. So this particular project, even though services were made available and provided, did show to us in a real concrete way the fear that the newly arriving asylum seekers in the last couple of years in this country have for our authorities. Thank you, Don.
Hey, Don, this is Brian. Bill, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Don? Great,
Yes.
thank you. So thanks for everything you've said. Thanks for organizing this and doing the research and including Catholic Charities USA and our member agencies. And Bill did a great service for setting up what of our agencies have been impacted by the refugee resettlement restructuring, and many of our agencies have had to figure out how to redeploy staff. But one other issue that has come up in our Catholic Charities Agency, which echoes a little bit of Bill's issue of people being afraid to come forward to get help, comes from a totally other source of information, which is we've been funded by a large philanthropy to enroll people in SNAP. So these are people that work in food pantries and soup kitchens and agencies throughout the country. And literally, they're trying to help people get onto the supplemental nutrition program. And so we have some data from various dioceses. So some statements like, yeah, people are afraid due to the current political climate surrounding immigrants and a proposed change to the public charge rule with immigration. An agency person in Atlanta says, a great deal of our clients have expressed much fear in applying for SNAP benefits in the United States for their United States citizen children. So again, that double edge of we have, mixed status families. In Idaho, Catholic Charities Idaho has faced barriers in engaging immigrant populations who are not receiving benefits due to their individual fears of legal consequences for the member of their families. Another story that comes from Pueblo. SNAP information was provided. They get an example. SNAP information was provided to 67 clients one night through our immigration services. Of those 67 clients, 59 refused to take the application because of fear that it might affect their immigration case and fear of the law's changes and their green card might be revoked. Only 8 took the application and stated that they would try to fill it out, but they may not in the end. So just that sense of people having this great fear. Sacramento, our food bank in Sacramento said, yes, there's a rampant spread of misinformation, mistrust, and fear of the current rhetoric. So many are not coming to benefit from CalFresh benefits, which is one of the programs that we help promote. So those are just some stories that we're getting in Santa Clara, Santa Rosa, Los Angeles, Stockton, Oregon. These are just the same stories we're hearing, that people are just afraid to come forward because of other issues. So this, in a sense, just looking at food security for a minute, I'll just take that as an edge or a wedge issue. So because people are afraid to apply for benefits that would get them out of the pantry system, as it were, help them get SNAP benefits, we're seeing a shift that those demands and those needs have to be fulfilled by our food pantries and our soup kitchens and our dining halls, and adding more burden to that while people are not taking advantage of the access to the public systems that they can. So that's shifting the burden all the way down and thus depleting some of our resources quicker because of that fear. So I think a lot of our food nutrition people and food security people are concerned just in one area. We haven't even begun to do research on HUD housing and voucher housing and the issue of mixed family status and the news that went on that. So we haven't even done our homework yet on that, but I'm sure stories will be coming forward on the fear of public housing with those announcements and regulatory changes that were announced. So there's that shifting burden. But in all fairness, I also have to say that our Catholic Charities agencies with refugee resettlement and with migration and with asylum cases and migrants coming in have continued to find ways to exert their faith and to say we're doing this. So one example of a diocese I'm just going to shout out is for Camden, New Jersey, has taken on a partnership with parishes and youth ministry and colleges, and they actually have connected with Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley with Sister Norma Pimentel and her guest house, and have created a share the journey encounter and a long-term process of working together. So again, they're trying to reach out and trying to find ways to help. Also, we have our border agencies, Rio Grande Valley, Laredo, San Antonio, Las Cruces, Tucson, Yuma, Albuquerque, San Bernardino, just to name a few that are at the heartbeat of it, who are working on a daily basis with ICE and the Customs and Border Protection Office. Every day, clients are being dropped off at our agencies that have been through the detention process or through the process with ICE. And basically, we get a phone call, one of our agents get a phone call and saying 350 people will be dropped off tonight at your agency. Please know we're coming. And those agencies are then helping process people overnight for 1 or 2 days, helping them get airline tickets. We have a great relationships with Miles for Migrants that we're working with them to help people get transportation to their destination. And so it's kind of mixed in that sense of people are afraid to come to our services. We see that. We see some shifting demands on the work that we do, but we also see some bright lights of agencies saying, no, we're going forward with dioceses and parishes, and we're going to do something regardless of the climate. So those are the kind of stories we're hearing here at Catholic Charities. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Brian. Estela, that sounds like you, is it?
Yes.
All
Finally,
right.
I got connected. All right.
Thank goodness. Yeah.
I'm sorry for the mess up. Anyway, I wanted to share my story in the pastoral work over here in the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, where we have had a decreased participation from previous years in the formation institutes that we offer for our community, for our leaders. I was looking at some pictures of 2 years ago, and our classes were completely full, and over 100 people. And right now, this year, we are graduating only 23 from one class, only 40 from the other one. So the decrease in participation it was huge. And definitely what the people are telling us, they are afraid to drive. They are afraid to drive. They do not have the documentation. We try to pass. We work really hard in the Congress to try to pass the driver license locally, and we couldn't. The government didn't help us. So people are extremely afraid to get out of the house. We have had a decreased numbers in our masses as well. In my own parishes, what the pastor decided to do is that we were going to go to them. So he organized a few different masses that he will do at the apartments complexes, so people didn't have to go out. And we had those throughout the summer last year. And that was, people felt very accompanied, and they were, it was a great success on that. Another thing that we are doing is, for example, we have a team of volunteers that are, people that do work in social justice in the other parishes and have signed up for this, that will take our immigrants to work, to medical appointments, and to schools. So those are the three elements that that they will drive people back and forth, and of course to court too, to court appearance and all that. So we have a great organization within those, and people that need the services can call a number, and we have another leaders that will arrange that. Another thing that we have done about transportation, because that is the main problem, that the impediment that people have to move, besides the snow of Minnesota, um, is that when we have big events, what we are doing is we are contracting buses to go to the parishes and bring the people in, because that is, I mean, we found out it, of course, is a little bit more expensive for our budget, but then we all can have the security that they will not be detained. Um, Definitely, I wanted to share that we have had periods where during court we had the ICE team completely unidentified, and after the immigrant did spoke to the judge and the judge spoke to him, and he let him go and all that, because it was a false accusation, whatever. The ICE team just grabbed him in a corner and took him, and we never saw him again. They just deported him on that following Tuesday. So people are extremely afraid. We even had a father, after dropping his 3-year-old in a daycare. When he got out to the parking lot, he was also detained. So those are, the instances that of course make people really faithful to go and to come to our parishes, and to do the regular activities that we used to do. Now, for the summertime, we are also doing some programs within the parishes, and we are trying to really concentrate on the neighborhood parishes to do events there, so they don't have to drive and be in that on the roads. And I don't know if you all have any questions.
People have been typing them, and we'll read some. But
All right.
it strikes me in listening to this that the Catholic institutions, as they always do, are really making extraordinary efforts to adapt and to serve immigrants despite all of these various issues. But the kinds of reports we're getting of families that are fearful of engaging in services, even as part of a reunification project, or afraid to go to court, or afraid to apply for public benefits or go to a food bank. Housing is the next one. And of course, as part of this survey, we heard people aren't attending Know Your Rights sessions, legal consultations, screening that might lead to status, decreased participation in citizenship workshops, people hesitant to leave home at night to drive, to apply for immigration benefits, programs serving unaccompanied children reporting that fewer sponsors are coming forward because they're required to share information about status, and that immigrants are avoiding and delaying even visits to hospitals or clinics out of fear of apprehension or deportation. So these are obviously kind of very, very serious problems. Most of all, first and foremost, for the immigrants, but also for the Catholic agencies, who are really doing extraordinary work in trying to work around these problems, and also to meet the increased demand for their services. So let's turn to some questions now, and I think they'll be asked to all of the speakers.
Hi, everyone. I will read some of the questions that the participants have raised throughout the webinar. So the first question, there were three participants, Katie, Sarah, and Anna, that asked similar questions. And the question was, will there be a recording of the webinar and slides available? Yes, the slides and the webinar will be available at CMS's website. And then a second question was from John Alexander for Brian. The question is, have you seen evidence of the increased strain on the pantry system by immigrants resulting in a ripple effect on the U.S. citizen population in need of those services? That is, higher resources drain resulting in strain or even breakdown in the ability of such organizations to deliver services more generally?
This is Brian. Thanks for that question. So I mean, it's a shifting that's going on, obviously, because more people aren't taking advantage of the SNAP protocol, which allowed them to get food security, so they don't have that monthly payment. So I guess we are trying to measure that draining of resources, but so far we haven't had a clarion call yet that they've run out any differently than in the past. So that's a great question. We'll probably in our next report that we'll ask for our SNAP enrollment program, we'll probably ask that question directly to get specific evidence, but I don't have anything in front of me. Our program manager may have some more data on that, but Jane's not here at the moment.
Thank you. Our second question is from Linda. Her question is for any of the panelists. Her question is, I'm happy that parishes are transporting migrants to services, court, church, etc. But are you addressing or planning for the possibility that the government could start prosecuting Good Samaritans for harboring the people to whom they give humanitarian aid?
Yeah, this is Bill Canny. We have seen even recently a case down along the border of a man who was being prosecuted for Good Samaritan, as a Good Samaritan, and one or two isolated cases. But I don't think that this is something we need to fear by any means. I believe that law enforcement, who are also citizens, and our judges and other people within our government, people of goodwill, I don't think that anyone is particularly interested in going down that route, except in some very isolated cases. Over.
Thank you. Another question. This is from Adam. One of the themes from this webinar that has stood out for me is the pivot of many agencies from refugee settlement to service delivery for asylum seekers. Do you see any long-term implications of this?
Yeah, this is Bill again. I do see some long-term implications in that, and I would say that there are two. One is that I think it has awakened many of us within these institutions, and through a ripple effect, many of our faithful Catholics and people of other faiths to the new immigration experience in the United States and the new asylum-seeking experience and the challenges with that. So I think that will be a long-term effect, a sort of renewed sensitivity and understanding. And then I think that secondly, it will cause us to relook at our organizations and what we're doing. Already, the Bishops' Conference and Catholic Charities and others are looking at, in a much deeper way than in the past, how to organize social, pastoral services for immigrants coming into the United States, asylum seekers. So I think that will have a long-term effect. And then I think eventually our government will make the connection between asylum seeking and people in need. In other words, we'll draw a closer line between sort of our moral responsibilities and our legal responsibilities by going through this very difficult period.
Thank you. Our other question is from Alba. The question is, regarding the volunteers to drive our migrant community, is there a concern regarding the possible harboring, aiding, and abetting? Open to the panelists.
Well, this is Estela. Probably it is, but our volunteers truly are very committed. We have had the talks about it, and they're very committed, and truly they are, we have the bravest people here in these teams, and truly we have another parish that have 2 apartments, and they are, putting families that are in need. So I think that the people that are serving right now, they are very much committed and, not afraid.
Thank you. The next
This is Brian.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I was just thinking it's also probably, as you read the cases of those that were prosecuted recently, there's a woman named Teresa Todd and the gentleman that was in Tucson. Teresa was in McAllen, and the other gentleman last week in Tucson. I think part of it is by volunteers staying connected to the Catholic Church through a parish or through Catholic Charities or something, it may help in the sense of that overall protection in many ways. So I think that's just important that pastoral leaders and agency directors understand what role they can play in terms of volunteers and liability. But I think it's also a way of saying that it's the Catholic Church's institutional response as well. So I think I'm sensing we have, so here's an example. Just in the past 2 months, we've sent 170 deployed Catholic Charities staff to Laredo, El Paso, and McAllen, and San Antonio. And these are Catholic Charities staff people who've been redeployed to help out for 2-week stints. No one has once mentioned any fear, nor has anyone been touched. So I think that's an important element in the whole conversation as well.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Laura. Her question is, what are some of the actions that local communities have taken to reduce barriers to access services and address the issue of fear given the current climate?
Yeah, this is Bill. A number of parishes have organized assistance to asylum seekers in providing them, for example, accompaniment to their ICE check-ins, helping to make sure that their papers are in order in the event that something happens, providing some security to the family, and helping children get to and fro school. So we have seen some parishes and other community groups organized specifically around issues of movement and accompaniment in order to reduce fear on the part of their brothers and sisters.
I think, by the way, Bill, you see that a lot in the response to the survey, that there's more accompaniment now, there's more rights presentations now, there's more services that are kind of designed and geared to the moment that we're living in. So I think that the charities and the parishes are very much focused on this issue.
Yeah.
This is Brian, just to add in. I think also we have to be aware that last night, the president put out a tweet about ICE roundups and ICE new levels of deportation. This morning, the Washington Post tried to get at the facts of that in other press. So I think we as a church probably need to be, A, like, is this really happening or not happening? And B, be cognizant. I know when I was a director of a local agency in Ohio, where we had several ICE raids, we were the first people called on all sides, from families, on the police, on the community, and the newspaper. So I think it might behoove us as a church community to find out what's going on with that most recent communication and get people prepared for that as well.
Yes,
We did,
absolutely.
this is Bill, meet earlier in the day with the head of DHS, Mr. McLennan, and he did not provide any details on the president's announcement. He said there would be additional commentary following up over the course of the week. He added that there was not an imminent risk of millions being removed, and that any enforcement actions would continue to target fugitives and recent arrivals who had final orders of removal.
It's just that I'm sure that I know that he said that, but our work shows that that's not what's happening. They're targeting more than that. They're being fairly indiscriminate about it, so.
Yeah. One of the things that we do within the community, as soon as you know some of the raids are going on, they will communicate and call me or send me a text, and I immediately put that in our Facebook and warn the communities of that neighborhood, or that just to be aware and make sure that they're not caught. So we we have a good communication system, and also through Flag Note, where we send to all of our leaders, and they're, like we have these women's groups that are 800 women, and that is an instant message. So it's very it's a very good tool that we have to communicate and avoid what we can avoid.
Okay, the next question is open to for any of the panelists. The question is, if a parish does not have a specific assistance program for refugees and asylum seekers, how can that parish best provide support to programs that are doing this important work?
So this is Bill. There are in communities many churches or non-faith groups that are taking the initiative to provide such services to asylum seekers and refugees. So I would encourage, parishes or areas that don't have specific resettlement programs to look around. You will find community groups or, again, other churches that you can join with and partner with in providing such services. And I think that we're going to see increasingly, and I know as we've looked at this post-Encuentro, we want to make sure we're also encouraging our parishes and faithful to look at joining and partnering with others in providing such assistance to new immigrants.
I think too, at this point, there's some very well documented parish-based programs that have been trying to expand. The Pastoral Migratoria and the Archdiocese of Chicago, of course, is expanding to other dioceses at this point. And the USCCB Power program has been a very strong program, but there's also others out there. So if there's interest in learning more about these, we'd be happy to provide that information to whoever asked that question.
Hello. The next question is from Judith. Give me one moment, please. Her question is, are you noticing a shift in the demographics of immigrant individuals taking advantage of the services your parishes and organizations offer?
Well, I think certainly what we found, and Mike can jump in on this, is that the people that are getting the services now are from the countries that you'd expect that they'd be from. They're from the Northern Triangle states of Central America. They're from Mexico, and but also, like an incredible diversity of other countries too. That probably represents a shift, over the last 5 years or something like that, 6 years. But I'd imagine it hasn't been a big change over the last few years anyway. That's who you'd expect, because those are the people that have been coming and that are in the greatest need.
This is Brian. Just another example. Just last week, several hundred Congolese migrants traveled from Africa to the South American continent, traveled through South America, through Central America, through Mexico, and ended up at the border, and they ended up at our Catholic Charities Agency in San Antonio. And for the past 2 days, they've been processing them, working with them, and many are going to Catholic Charities in Portland, Maine, and Catholic Charities of Buffalo, New York. So it's a whole other strand of people that just popped in the past week for us.
Yeah, and I'd say that the Scalabrini shelters are seeing far more African migrants now too. So
Judith had another question. Her question is, as you increase your focus on service delivery for asylum seekers, is legal assistance becoming a larger part of the services offered? If so, why or why not?
I don't know if that's a question for the refugee side, Bill, but I can tell you that on the legal side, that the Catholic Church's legal work with immigrants has been very, very robust for many years now, and I'm sure we have representatives from the Catholic Legal Immigration Network on this call. I think Jeff Chenoweth and others signed up for it. So they have at this point something like 350 affiliated programs, offices that they support around the country. And I'm sure that the demand for legal services in fact, I know that the demand for legal services has increased very significantly over the last 2 years, and I'm sure that there's been some expansion there.
Yeah, also, I think that there's an effort in Clinic is doing this also. I happen to be on their board, an effort to place more legal assistance along the border, and now even on the Mexican side, since we have the Remain in Mexico policy and thousands of asylum seekers to the United States are being forced to wait for their case to be called, if you will. On the Mexican side of the border, Clinic and other organizations are looking at assisting the Mexican humanitarian and legal providers to increase their support to asylum seekers to the United States. So I know Clinic is very concerned, very active, and taking action.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Estela, go ahead.
No, I wanted to mention that we also have other lawyers' offices that are flying to the border just to help to process people, and they don't speak any Spanish at all. So we have another set of volunteers that over the phone they do all the interpretation for them. So and those are the hopeful moments, where you can see the true God in people and how they help each other is absolutely marvelous.
We have another question from Marva. Her question is, Estela made a point about the use of technology as a way to communicate with individuals. Are you using codes as security personnel has access to the high tech?
If I'm using what? I'm sorry, I didn't.
If you're using codes, since it appears as security personnel has access to tech.
Oh, no, not really. We are not using any codes specifically. Yeah, but maybe we should start doing that.
Okay. Our next question is from Alba. Her question is, for how are parishes encouraged from the USCCB to allow volunteers to journey with our migrant communities? I'm concerned that parishes are fearful for their communities.
So the Catholic bishops have been very concerned about this for many years and have a number of offices, including migration and refugee services, cultural diversity, pastoral care for immigrants, to encourage bishops, dioceses, and parishes to engage the newcomer, to provide both pastoral, certainly support, but also support in in a social and economic sense. The fifth encuentro process has, I think, kind of reignited an interest in the Catholic Church, particularly the Spanish-speaking community. The Latino leaders, such as Estela, who's on the phone, have brought forth the need through the encuentro process for the Church to engage even more. And so we have formed a national platform as requested by Encuentro, and it's a platform that will be advised by Catholic Hispanic-speaking persons from across the country and that the goal is to create some resources for parishes, to encourage, to find ways to facilitate and encourage diocesan structures, but importantly, parish structures to become more involved in both welcoming the newcomer, but as important, learning and from the refugee and asylum seeker, and learning, perhaps new ways to even exercise their spirituality through encounter with the newcomer, through being with them and learning together. So I think we're at a bit of a new phase here. Again, thanks to Encuentro and the hard work of many Spanish-speaking Catholics across the country. I think the conference is poised to work with Catholic Charities, Clinic, Catholic Relief Services, and the diocese and these leaders across the country to provide an impetus to the Church to facilitate a greater dialogue with newcomers among us.
Thank you for joining us today. To download the report, please visit cmsny.org. To subscribe to CMS's mailing list, please visit our website and click the Sign Up button at the top of the page. For questions or comments, please send us an email at gchavez@cmsny.org. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks particularly to Bill and to Brian and to Estela.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.